Your subscription makes my day brighter. Like, subscribe, and let's create something amazing together. The screams had long faded into background noise, just another part of her world like the iron bars, the sharp stench of oil and old blood, the buzz of electric collars. Kaylee had forgotten the concept of time. Her tiny hands were scarred from work she couldn't even remember starting, her eyes dulled to the endless flashes of pain. She didn't cry anymore. Crying got attention. Attention meant pain. So she sat, curled in the corner of her cage, arms wrapped around her knees, silent and still. When the lights flickered red, everyone else started wailing again, but not her. Red lights meant death. Red lights meant another one gone. And Kaylee had long since stopped believing she would be rescued. Far above the slave pits of Velterra, in orbit, someone had finally drawn a line. The United Systems Task Force had been tracking the slaver operation for months, and now, finally, they were moving in. The commandos were mostly humans, and among them was Sergeant Mason Carter, a soldier shaped by wars he never wanted and a grief he never shared. He wasn't on this mission for medals. He was here because he had seen too many things like this. Because once, years ago, a disease took his own daughter back on Earth. And something in him snapped that day, not in rage, but in resolve. They breached the slave complex with brutal precision. Gunfire echoed through the corridors. Kaylee only noticed the sound when the screaming stopped. It was strange, the silence. Like a wrong note on an old song. Then the metal doors to her cell block exploded inward. She flinched. Smoke poured in. She tucked her head down, waiting for a blow. Instead, heavy boots clanked across the floor. There were voices, loud, commanding, but not cruel. She peeked through strands of matted hair. A man stood in front of her cage, tall and broad-shouldered, with dull eyes like weathered steel. He looked straight at her, then crouched. He didn't reach in. He didn't bark orders. He just waited. Like he was waiting for her to decide if he was real. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe now." No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not even before she was captured. Something cracked in her chest, something she didn't understand. Her legs refused to move. She stared, frozen. So he took off his coat, the thick military one, and gently slid it through the bars. Then he unlatched the door. She still didn't move. He stepped back, giving her space, and for the first time in her life, she felt what choice tasted like. Kaylee crawled out slowly. Her eyes never left his. She was trembling, but her hands reached for the coat. She wrapped it around herself, drowning in the warmth and weight. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She took a step forward. He caught her before she fell. Her legs were too weak to hold her, but his arms were solid, and his grip was firm without being rough. She buried her face into his chest, and a sound escaped her throat. Not a word. Not quite a sob. Just a breath. A shudder. Mason didn't ask her name. He didn't demand answers. He just lifted her up gently, and carried her away from the place where hope had once died. She clung to him like a shadow. Even when the medics tried to separate them, she refused to let go. Not even when they offered her food, water, warm blankets. She clung to his coat, to his presence. She didn't know why. She only knew that something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was safety. Maybe it was warmth. Maybe it was something deeper. Back on the shuttle, Mason sat with her as the ship lifted from the surface. The other soldiers watched, some with curiosity, others with silent respect. He looked down at her and, for the first time in years, thought of his daughter. Her name had been Emily. She used to cling to him like that during thunderstorms. He didn't believe in science, but the weight of the girl in his lap felt like something more than coincidence. Kaylee stared at the stars through the shuttle window. Her fingers clutched the edge of his coat tightly. She didn't understand what this journey meant, or where she was going. But she knew this: she wasn't in the cage anymore. And the man beside her didn't hurt her. He protected her. That alone felt like a miracle. When they reached the command vessel, she refused to let go of his hand. Mason didn't fight it. He understood trauma. He'd seen it in fellow soldiers, in civilians rescued from war zones. But in her, it was different. It was deeper. And somehow more fragile. She didn't cry. Didn't beg. She just held on, quietly, as if the moment she let go, the nightmare would come back. Later, in the debriefing room, as officers discussed protocols and medical evaluations, Mason said just one thing. She stays with me. There were protests. Regulations. Ethics. But Mason didn't budge. His record was spotless, his reputation unshakable. They knew better than to argue. And so, with special clearance, Kaylee was listed as a protected dependent under Earth military asylum law. In the quiet of the officers' quarters, Mason wrapped her in clean blankets and placed a warm meal beside her. She didn't eat at first. Just sat, eyes wide, watching every movement, listening to every sound. But as the hours passed, she leaned into his presence again. Eventually, her head rested against his arm. She slept. Mason watched her breathing, slow and even. For the first time in years, something inside him eased. He didn't know what the future held. But at that moment, with the child who wasn't his curled beside him, he felt purpose again. She was no longer just a rescued slave. She was a soul. And she was finally free. Kaylee's presence changed everything. She didn't speak, but her silence spoke louder than any words. On board the carrier, people moved around her with awkward deference, curious, cautious, but mostly unsure. Soldiers who had seen horrors in the field averted their eyes when she walked by, clinging to Sergeant Mason Carter's arm. She wouldn't leave his side, not even to sleep. The medic said it was trauma bonding. Mason didn't care about the labels. He saw only a child who had survived hell, and something inside him told him she needed one steady thing in her life. If that had to be him, so be it. There was a particular way she reacted to sounds, sharp tools, clicking doors, raised voices. She'd freeze, curl inward, or press into Mason like she was trying to vanish inside him. And every time she did, he burned a little more with quiet rage at what had been done to her. She wasn't just another victim. She was a reminder that evil wasn't abstract. It had shape, routine, structure. She was evidence. The United Systems Command wanted her processed, relocated, put through a recovery protocol. But Mason fought it. He argued not with passion but with quiet authority. She wouldn't survive being shuffled from base to base, surrounded by strangers in white coats. She didn't trust anyone but him. And if they forced her away, they'd break her all over again. So they granted him special exemption. She became his charge, officially. On paper, she was a civilian dependent under Protection Clause 412A. In practice, she followed him like a shadow. She didn't speak for days, but when she finally whispered something in the dark, it was his name. Not sir, not soldier, just Mason. It was soft and uncertain, like tasting a word that might vanish if spoken too loud. She refused to wear anything that wasn't his. She'd tear at the provided clothes until they gave her back his coat. It drowned her small frame, but she never took it off. Even during checkups. Even when she bathed. He had to convince her to hand it over briefly for cleaning by promising she'd get it right back. Trust was built in small pieces. He understood that. Mason wasn't an emotional man. War had carved that out of him long ago. But Kaylee made him feel again, not with sentiment, but with responsibility. He had carried wounded friends, buried comrades, saved strangers. But none of that felt as fragile, as vital, as the quiet weight of her presence. He began adjusting everything around her, his routines, his language, even how he carried his gear. She became part of every decision, every calculation. Not out of duty. Out of something deeper. A bond that grew without permission. When he spoke with the other soldiers, she'd stand beside him, eyes flicking from face to face, evaluating. She learned to recognize danger in expressions, in posture. She could tell when someone was pretending to be kind. And she would pull closer to Mason's side. The crew began to understand. Earning her trust was harder than surviving the front lines. She had no tolerance for lies. No space for games. Her world was divided between harm and safety, and she had drawn that line with terrifying clarity. Mason began training again. He couldn't stay inactive for long. His body needed movement, structure. But she followed him even there. He requested private use of the training bay, and command, recognizing the political and personal complexity of his situation, agreed. She would sit silently on the edge of the mat, watching him spar against dummies, lift weights, run drills. She didn't flinch at violence, but she always watched his eyes, checking to make sure he was still in control. One day, without warning, she mimicked a stance he'd taken. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even useful. But it was hers. And when he noticed, he nodded once, not laughing, not patronizing. Just acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, she began to move differently. Still silent, still cautious, but more deliberate. She wasn't recovering. She was adapting. She watched people like they were puzzles. She read rooms better than trained interrogators. And slowly, Mason realized something chilling. This wasn't just a child rescued from horror. This was someone shaped by it, someone learning to survive in the world she had been thrown into. Her nightmares were brutal. She never screamed, but she'd wake gasping, clinging to him, eyes wide with terror. He wouldn't ask what she saw. He didn't need to know. He just held her until her breathing slowed, until she trusted the dark again. Sometimes she'd touch his face afterward, as if making sure he was still real. The officers began checking in on her progress. Mason kept his answers simple. She eats. She sleeps. She doesn't talk much. But she's alive. That was more than anyone had expected. Privately, some wondered why he was so invested. Others whispered that he was using her trauma to cover his own. Maybe they weren't wrong. He hadn't dealt with Emily's death. He hadn't cried, hadn't mourned. He just kept marching. Maybe Kaylee was a second chance at saving someone. But if that was the case, he didn't care. All that mattered was that she was safe, and he intended to keep her that way. One day, while cleaning a mess kit together, she looked up at him and said, "Why did you come for me?" He paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because hearing her voice, full and clear, hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "Because no one else did," he said. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then went back to scrubbing. She never said thank you. She didn't need to. She followed him because she had chosen to, and Mason understood what that meant. In her eyes, trust was sacred. Not earned by kindness alone, but by consistency. Presence. Action. And now, her presence was shaping him just as much as his presence had saved her. He no longer saw her as a burden, a mission, or a responsibility. She was his. And more importantly, he was hers. Mason's transfer orders came unexpectedly. The mission was over, they said. The colony secured, the trafficking ring disrupted. He was being reassigned to a high-threat zone along the Orion frontier. It wasn't a surprise. He'd stirred too much dust, gone off-book too often. Command tolerated results, but not independence. Kaylee received no orders. Technically, she was still a civilian. No one expected her to follow him into the next war. Mason didn't ask her to come. He just handed her a rucksack and made space beside his bunk. She didn't speak. She simply walked beside him to the transport, sat quietly, and watched the stars shift as the vessel left orbit. The frontier wasn't like the inner systems. It was raw, unfiltered danger. Settlements were spread thin. Communications often delayed or jammed entirely. Pirates weren't just criminals here, they were warlords. Raids were constant. Civilian losses high. Mason was embedded with a joint task force, but the lines between military and survival blurred quickly. Orders came late. Supplies came later. Morality came last. But Kaylee adjusted. She didn't flinch at emergency med drills, field operations, or combat briefings. She absorbed everything with relentless focus. She no longer followed Mason. She moved in tandem, a quiet shadow with eyes that missed nothing. Her knowledge of slaver tactics made her invaluable. She identified patterns in disappearances, hidden trade signals, and encryption trails that military intelligence overlooked. Mason pushed for her to be given auxiliary clearance. It wasn't protocol, but no one argued. Her insights led to the discovery of a mobile slave processing hub disguised as a refugee clinic. The raid exposed another network, this time with ties to high-value figures in the Frontiers Logistics Command. Mason filed the report. The investigation was buried. He learned then that the route went deeper than he imagined. Profits trumped lives, even out here. Kaylee became a rumor among the troops. Some whispered she was enhanced, others said she was a revenant, an alien touched by human weapons, reborn for vengeance. She said nothing. Mason neither confirmed nor denied. Let them wonder. It gave her room to operate. She moved through outposts unnoticed, gathering fragments, faces seen, names half heard, cargo manifests slightly off. Each piece built a picture. The enemy wasn't just active. It was expanding. One night, Mason woke to find Kaylee analyzing intercepted transmissions alone, muttering in Philidrin. Her hands trembled. She told him they were moving children through the asteroid belt known as the Cinder Spine. It wasn't just a waypoint. It was a slaughter route. Those who didn't meet quotas were discarded. Left in pods. Frozen. Abandoned. Mason contacted Central Command for intervention. They delayed, citing jurisdiction issues. He sent the data regardless. Then, without waiting, he assembled a small strike team. Unauthorized, under-equipped, but willing. They launched a silent incursion into the belt. No formal sanction, no support. What they found was worse than the data had suggested. Holding cells built into hollowed-out asteroids, medical waste dumped into space, digital logs of auctions arranged across systems. Kaylee identified a signal pattern she'd seen once as a child. It marked the ones considered unsellable, disposable. Mason's team evacuated as many as they could, 18 souls, barely breathing. They destroyed the stations with improvised charges. No survivors among the slavers. Word spread again. This time, Mason wasn't hailed as a hero. He was labeled a risk. An officer who defied orders, acted emotionally, endangered diplomacy. He was recalled. But the transport never arrived. It was ambushed mid-route. Wreckage drifted for weeks. No bodies recovered. Officially, Mason was declared Kia. The report closed with honors. Another casualty of the frontier war. In reality, Mason had faked the extraction. With Kaylee's help, he erased his digital trail. They didn't want to be found. Not by command. Not by the enemy. They went dark, off-grid, deep space. Kaylee routed them through forgotten trade routes, obsolete jump gates, and old rebel hideouts. They weren't fugitives. They were hunters. What followed was a campaign no one documented. Small raids. Fast strikes. No mercy. Each hit freed captives, disrupted supply chains, and eliminated key operators. Mason no longer wore rank. Kaylee no longer hid behind silence. She led some of the operations, coordinating with defectors, fringe militias, and even former slaves who chose to fight back. They formed a network, nameless, untraceable, and effective. Kaylee changed. She spoke more often, but always in terms of objectives, routes, numbers. Emotion drained from her voice. She had made peace with her purpose. Not revenge. Not justice. Continuation. A mission that wouldn't end until the last cage was shattered. Mason worried, but he didn't stop her. He couldn't. She wasn't driven by hatred. She was powered by memory. Sometimes, they encountered children too broken to speak. Kaylee sat with them for hours. She never forced words. Just stayed. Sometimes, they stared at her with the same hollow gaze she once carried. And sometimes, one of them would finally reach for her hand. That was enough. They didn't need explanations. They saw in her what Mason had seen all along, someone who understood without asking. Years passed. Their names became myths in certain circles. To slavers, they were phantoms. To the rescued, they were salvation. Some began calling her Ash Eyes, a name from Philidran folklore, meaning one who rises from ruin. She never acknowledged the title. But Mason saw how it affected her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just carried it. Like everything else. Mason kept records, encrypted, hidden across systems. One file remained untouched, the original footage of him freeing her from that cage. He watched it sometimes in silence. The girl she was no longer existed. In her place stood a force shaped by pain, sharpened by resilience, and committed to an unrelenting mission. He no longer questioned the cost. He had made his choice the day he stepped into that slaver camp. And Kaylee had made hers the moment she refused to leave his side. Together, they had become something more than soldier and survivor. They were consequence. A reckoning dressed in shadows. And they weren't finished yet. They had been gone so long that the war itself had changed. What began as a campaign against frontier trafficking had mutated into a broader conflict over resources, territory, and ideology. The old slaver networks had evolved, hiding behind shell corporations, sanctioned guilds, and diplomatic immunity. Nations that once condemned the practice now turned a blind eye when profits aligned with silence. Even humanity's central command had shifted priorities, focusing on border expansion and planetary acquisition. Mason and Kaylee, operating far from any official banner, realized that the enemy was no longer just slavers. It was complicity, and it had infiltrated every major power. Their next objective wasn't a hidden station or obscure convo. It was a corporate summit on Culvrex 4, a supposedly neutral planet hosting a trade alliance between several frontier systems. Kaylee had traced encrypted logs showing that under the guise of trade negotiations, human and alien representatives were brokering live labor deals. Slavery, cleaned up, renamed, and normalized. Mason understood the risks. This wasn't a target they could dismantle in silence. It would require exposure. But they had one advantage left: testimony. Not from Kaylee. From the rescued. Survivors who could no longer be ignored. They reached out to those they'd helped over the years. Former slaves who had rebuilt lives, joined medical corps, taught in refugee schools, even risen to advisory positions in fringe governments. Quietly, through secure channels, they assembled a coalition. People of different species, backgrounds, and beliefs, all linked by the moment they had been pulled from hell and offered a second chance. These weren't soldiers. They were truth-bearers. Mason and Kaylee didn't ask them to fight. They asked them to speak. To show the galaxy that the scars were real, the pain hadn't vanished, and the criminals hadn't disappeared, they had adapted. The summit opened with the usual pageantry. Speeches about economic opportunity, peace-building, and interstellar cooperation. Kaylee watched from the shadows, eyes scanning every guest, every device, every symbol on a lapel. She no longer needed confirmation. She knew the faces of those who profited from misery. She had studied their habits, watched their auctions, followed the credits as they flowed through layers of deniability. She had names. And soon, so would everyone else. Mason uploaded the compiled evidence to every public channel he could access. Testimonies, recordings, financial trails. He didn't bother hiding his identity. He wanted them to know who did it. The impact was immediate. Chaos erupted. Delegates walked out. Protests ignited across neutral planets. The footage of a human soldier carrying a frail alien girl from a slave pen played across networks for days. People wept. Others denied it. Some tried to discredit the evidence. But it was too late. The story had escaped control. The backlash came fast. Mason and Kaylee were branded extremists. A bounty was placed on their heads, not just by crime syndicates, but by corporations that had lost stock value. Even human officials distanced themselves, calling them rogue actors. But among the people, something stirred. Volunteers emerged. Not for violence, but for information. Every day, Kaylee received anonymous drops, locations of hidden compounds, signs of trafficking routes, sightings of wanted figures. The galaxy, once indifferent, had started to see. Still, the costs grew heavier. One by one, safe havens turned hostile. Allies were captured or disappeared. Rumors spread of black site prisons where whistleblowers vanished without trace. Mason was injured during an extraction mission on Barrows. Shrapnel to the side, broken ribs. He survived, but slower. Kaylee took over more of the coordination. She operated with a precision that disturbed even seasoned operatives. She anticipated betrayals, redirected attacks, dismantled networks. But Mason noticed the toll. She rarely slept. She barely ate. She was burning from within, held together only by will. He confronted her once, asking what she would do if it all ended tomorrow. If they finally won. Her answer was quiet. She said she didn't believe in winning. She believed in less suffering. One child saved. One cage broken. That was enough. The war wasn't about victory. It was about endurance. She didn't expect peace. She only hoped to live long enough to see fewer nightmares than memories. Mason said nothing. There was nothing to argue. She had never been naive. News arrived that several high-profile slaver leaders were fleeing to a fortified moon in the Sarnes cluster. It was the last viable sanctuary left. A final stronghold. Mason and Kaylee knew it would be their last major operation. They couldn't chase shadows forever. This one needed to end publicly and completely. With help from Allied crews, they infiltrated the facility, disabled its communications, and forced a live broadcast during the takedown. The galaxy watched as figures once immune to consequence were marched out in chains. The moon's vaults contained not just wealth, but records. Proof of dealings with generals, executives, and council members. The fallout was unprecedented. Trials erupted across systems. Dozens of officials were exposed. A galactic tribunal was formed. Slavery, long cloaked in euphemisms, was once again acknowledged for what it was. And this time, people demanded accountability. Not all systems responded. Some doubled down. Others threatened secession. But enough stood up to mark a turning point. A fracture in the silence. Kaylee didn't attend the celebrations. She remained on the outskirts, watching others hold banners, chant names, cry tears she had never been able to shed. Mason stood beside her. He asked if she felt anything. She said she didn't know how to measure feelings anymore. But she hoped, quietly, stubbornly, that maybe, somewhere, a child was sleeping safely tonight because of what they had done. Their ship, now old and scarred, lifted off from Sarnes one last time. No destination filed. No mission planned. Just two souls bound not by duty, but by choice. They had turned the tide. Not with fleets or armies, but with memory, pain, and relentless action. The galaxy might never be perfect. But it would remember them. Not as ghosts. Not as outlaws. But as proof that even in the darkest corners of space, humanity still had the power to choose compassion over convenience. And sometimes, that was enough. Kaylee stood at the edge of a world that no longer resembled the one she had escaped from. For the first time, she was no longer hunted, no longer running from the past. The chains had been broken not only from her limbs but from her spirit. Yet peace, as it turned out, did not feel like the triumph she had imagined. It felt quiet. Unfamiliar. The galaxy had changed, but so had she. The war had carved a permanent shape into her being, and now she faced something more daunting than any battlefield, freedom with no enemy left to fight. Mason had grown tired. His body bore the marks of years spent in fire and blood. His left hand no longer clenched properly from an old injury. His right eye was blurred by a blast shard. But none of those wounds compared to what he carried inside. He had witnessed more than any soldier should have. He had carried children too light to be alive. He had spoken to prisoners who didn't remember their names. And through it all, he had watched Kaylee transform from a scared, quiet girl into a voice that moved entire systems. She had never belonged to him. She had chosen to stay, and that choice had changed the course of countless lives. Now they were being offered medals, titles, even seats on advisory councils. Governments wanted to parade them as symbols of justice, rebrand them as figures of restored order. Mason declined every offer. Kaylee did the same. They hadn't done this for recognition. Their work had never been about fame or position. It had been about humanity, its capacity to destroy, yes, but also to redeem. A soldier and a slave. That's how it began. That's all it ever needed to be. Their ship landed quietly on a rehabilitated colony world that once served as a trafficking hub. Now it was home to refugees rebuilding their lives. Kaylee visited the new schools built with funding from planets they had once fought. She watched children of every species laugh without fear, run without looking over their shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile at the sight. There was no ceremony. No applause. Just life continuing without chains. That was the only reward she had ever wanted. Mason, meanwhile, worked with local security units, teaching them how to spot the signs of underground trade, how to interrogate without breaking spirits, how to protect without domination. He knew too well how institutions could be corrupted, how even noble missions could twist into new forms of oppression. So he stayed vigilant, not as a soldier, but as a guardian of what they had earned with so much pain. He didn't trust the galaxy to stay clean. He only trusted that people like them could stop it from becoming filthy again. But even in peace, the ghosts lingered. Kaylee would wake some nights gripping her blanket as if it were a restraint. Mason sometimes heard screams that weren't there, saw faces that didn't exist. They never spoke about it much. What could be said? The past did not vanish. It merely receded. The difference now was they no longer carried it alone. Every person they'd saved, every child who lived, carried a fragment of that burden forward, and lightened the load with each step. Then came a message either expected. A girl, barely 12 standard years, had used the archived testimonies Kaylee had helped publish to escape a new trafficking ring hiding under a medical foundation. She had named Kaylee as her inspiration. Said she memorized her story, trusted her voice, and followed the same path. That single message did more to heal Kaylee than any award could. She wasn't just someone who had survived, she was someone who had become a map for others still trapped. Mason read the message with her, then placed it beside the old, worn photograph he kept of the day he first found Kaylee in the wreckage. She had been too afraid to speak then, covered in ash and blood. But in that frozen moment, something unspoken had passed between them. A promise. Now, looking at the message from a girl they'd never met, he understood something deeper. They had become part of a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Eventually, age caught up to Mason. His injuries worsened, and he no longer joined patrols. He walked slower, rested more. Kaylee stayed by his side, not out of obligation, but out of something stronger, loyalty born from shared scars. She could have left 1,000 times. She didn't. Not once. And when he finally sat beneath the twin suns of a quiet evening and closed his eyes for the last time, she held his hand. Not as the girl he saved, but as the woman who saved him in return. After his passing, Kaylee disappeared from public view. Rumors spread. Some said she returned to the stars, others claimed she joined a resistance deep within the systems still corrupted by silence. But the truth wasn't in where she went. It was in what remained. Every colony with a functioning school, every child not branded for sale, every soldier who refused an unjust order, those were her footprints. That was her monument. Years later, on the anniversary of the Sarni's raid, a statue was erected. Not in marble or gold, but in polished scrap metal salvaged from liberated camps. It depicted not warriors, but two figures walking side by side. No weapons. No armor. Just a human soldier and an alien girl. No names etched. Just one line. We walk forward together. In the end, their story was not about violence or vengeance. It was about choice. A choice to stop, to care, to act. In a galaxy where indifference reigned supreme, they chose to feel. And through that choice, they shattered the walls built by fear and profit. Their story became a quiet legend told in refugee camps, in military academies, in the whispered dreams of children who now believed in the impossible. That one human somewhere out there had seen not an alien, not a statistic, not a burden, but a soul. And once you see a soul, you can never unsee it. That was their gift. And the galaxy would never forget it.